And welcome to our
Sure.
session.
Thank you so much, Andy, and to everyone who's here tonight. I'm really pleased to be here. It's such an important time to be thinking about immigration and the work that teachers are doing every day on this subject. We know in the Center for Global Migration Studies is extremely important. So I'm very happy to be here tonight.
Jill, I'm going to give you control of the PowerPoint. You can advance it according to your own speed and conversation. But before we begin, I'd like to just ask you kind of an extemporaneous question. I'm curious, you know, we bring scholars like yourself, university educators to these sessions. You're with educators from across the country. You likely teach the students that these participants taught several years ago. I'm curious, when kids show up to your class at University of Maryland, just outside of DC, what do you have to unteach them about immigration? You know, so often when we're teaching, we're actually trying to dispel all the incorrect assumptions that kids bring in rooms, kids of any age. What do you have to unteach about immigration?
You know, that's a tough question because I don't usually feel like I have to unteach much of anything. There is so much hunger to understand it better. And I feel like the students come to Maryland, of course, many of them are themselves immigrants or second generation students. And even those who are not, immigration is so much an issue all around us. And I guess they've been prepared well in high school. I also teach labor history by comparison. And when I teach labor history, I find I have to dispel all kinds of misunderstandings about workers and working people and unions. But with immigration, they're really ready to learn.
That's fantastic. I think, you know, what really stood out from that answer, from your answer, is this notion that they're bringing a personal experience to the conversation. Yeah,
that's absolutely right. And immigration is a great thing to teach because you, sooner or later, when you're teaching the history, you're hitting almost every student's family history that's in the room, one way or another. You know, you begin with indigenous people being affected by migration, you deal with coerced migration of people from Africa, and then as you move through the history, you see, you know, you get to the Irish and you see that kid in the back who's Irish American sits up a little straighter and pays more attention, and so on throughout the whole chronology. And one way or another, you get all of them engaged and involved.
Which is, I think, a lovely argument, really, for integrating immigration kinds of topics and themes much more broadly in the curriculum that we teach, rather than just when it may come up in the textbook or may seem to, you know, to pop up and be explicit in some specific point.
Absolutely.
Great. Well, thank you so much for that answer, and we're looking forward to your conversation tonight. As I mentioned, I'll be mining the question and answer box, and on occasion I might briefly interrupt you and bring those questions to you, but we're anxious to learn.
Great. Yes, please feel free to interrupt me anytime. So I begin with this quote from a Slavic immigrant in 1908. "My people are not a part of America, they are underneath America." I first read that comment probably 20 years ago, and it has stuck with me ever since because it captures something so central and real to the history of immigration. You know, that central irony in American 19th and 20th century history of immigrants wanted here because they provide relatively cheap labor, and yet not wanted here to be full members of society and politics. And that tension is not only central to U.S. history, but really what I want to explore tonight. From the early 19th century with Germans and Irish to the present day, immigrants have faced xenophobia, by which I mean simply anti-immigrant sentiment and hostility. This xenophobia kind of ebbs and flows, and it's very much intertwined with struggles for acceptance and equality by immigrants themselves. And so it's that intertwined history that not only shapes every aspect of the world we live in the United States, but that I also want to explore tonight. So I thought I'd start just with a quick reminder of the different waves of immigration that I'll be talking about tonight. With the first wave of mass immigration beginning in the 1840s, lasting to the 1890s. Often scholars call these old immigrants, nearly 16 million people entering the United States. Most often they were Irish and Germans. And you see a photograph here of my great-great-grandparents, Henry and Sophia Meinzen, who emigrated from Germany in the 1850s. You also had smaller numbers of Chinese immigrants as well, who were drawn here originally by the gold rush in California. And although their numbers were very, very small compared to other groups, they, as we'll see, played an extremely important role in shaping immigration policy in the United States. The second wave, the so-called new immigrants, roughly 1890 to 1924, you still see in this period a lot of Irish and Germans coming, but now they begin to be outnumbered by Eastern and Southern Europeans, Italians, Russians, Hungarians, and as well, you can see continued immigration by some Chinese and other Asians, Japanese, South Asians as well. Here's a quick map just to give us a little visual sense of the migration at that turn of the 20th century, which sees more immigration proportionally to the U.S. population than any other time in U.S. history, including the present day. And you can see from this map what I was just saying, that Northern and Western European immigrants are still coming in very large numbers, but their numbers are overwhelmed by the new immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe.
Before you move on, Professor, I wonder if it's all right, I'm going to go back to that last slide. Suzanne has asked if you'll speak just a little bit to the push-pull factors that brought groups like the Germans to America in the 1840s through the 1890s. What was the pull?
Yeah, right. The single biggest factor for that period and for the one that follows at the turn of the 20th century both was industrialization and mechanization of agriculture and the spreading of a cash economy. As all of those things happen, families start to find they need some cash income, and they start to send maybe an older son, at first maybe just to a city in Europe, or then finally they start thinking about going to America. For the Irish, though, it was a little bit different, because for the Irish, it was the potato famine and increasing control over land by the English aristocracy. The potato famine in particular really devastated Ireland, caused mass starvation, and forced millions of people to flee the country just in order to avoid starvation.
And as a follow-up question, this one's from Mike. Tell us how, in your view, the Civil War may have impacted the pace and the quantity of immigration. Was there an interruption during the 4 to 5 years of the early 1860s?
Yes. The Civil War has a big impact on immigration. It does reduce the numbers, and it also really calms down the xenophobia or nativism that emerged in the 1840s and 50s in response to so many Irish and Germans entering the United States.
Fantastic, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so third period, we talk about 1924 to 1965, these low levels of immigration, because the National Origins Act of 1924 sets very harsh racial quotas on who can enter the United States, and it includes a sweeping ban on any and all Asian immigration. So European immigrants become, as their migration is halted, become more Americanized. There's actually more Filipino migration, even though there's a sweeping ban on Asian immigration. Filipinos are not technically immigrants because they are colonial subjects of the United States at this time. So Filipino migration increases, as does Mexican migration. And for those groups, the decades from 24 to 65 becomes a time where they're facing increasing hostility and racialization from native-born Americans.
Interestingly, Professor, you are in some ways a lifeline right now for one of Phoebe Sherman's students who just asked her today this question, and I wonder if you can respond to it. Specifically between 1880 and 1924, how did immigrants demonstrate resistance to the discrimination they were experiencing? Other than progressive reforms from the era, she didn't really have a good answer. Can you speak at all to the experiences of unity or resistance to discrimination among this era?
Yeah, yes, absolutely. And in fact, that's something I'm planning to deal with a little more fully later in the lecture. Shall I wait for that?
Sure. I'm going to bring these questions when it seems to make sense, but you are more than welcome to postpone it, and I know Phoebe will be patient until we get to it in a little while.
Okay. If Phoebe feels impatient, just holler again.
She's a little impatient, to be honest with you, Phoebe, but she'll be okay tonight. Thank you.
The next wave and the last one that we're really living through still now comes as a result of the 1965 Hart-Celler Act, which vastly expands and diversifies immigration. It removes those racially influenced quotas that had been created in 1924 and leads to much more immigration, particularly from Africa, Asia, and Latin America. And yet, in subtle ways, but very important ways, it discriminated against Latin Americans and thus helped to generate much more undocumented migration. We'll look a little bit more fully at that later on in the lecture as well. So this chart, this is a really helpful chart for the 20th century, showing when immigration has peaked and lowered, and you can right away visually see from that the ways in which that 1924 Act begins to decrease immigration, and then the ways in which the 1965 Act begins to see it rise again. So, any questions about that? If not, I'll turn to looking more specifically at xenophobia and how it waxed and waned over these different waves of immigration.
No questions to this point, thank you.
Okay, so patterns of xenophobia. As I mentioned at the beginning, most immigrants face some degree of xenophobia, but those who seem most different, and often the term we hear is the issue of assimilability, or if someone is seen as unassimilable, they face worse hostility. That hostility changes in the form it takes over time, and it's also, we can see by looking at what else is happening in the US at the time, we see that it's more severe when native-born Americans feel threatened by other kinds of change. When inequality is increasing in the United States, when jobs are scarce, when there's unemployment, when people have trouble with health, any of those things tend to generate more anxiety and more hostility about immigration. So going back to that first wave of when the Irish and the Germans dominated immigration, you can see from this image or these two cartoons, you can get a sense right away of some of the xenophobia immigrants face. I wonder if people see anything interesting in the ways that Irish and Germans are presented in these images.
Well, let's take a moment and invite the audience to add their thoughts and their impressions in the chat box. Take a look at those two images. Tell us what you see. Tell us some of the details or the implications of those details, any both implicit or explicit understandings you might pull from it. And Julie, you can see in the lower right-hand corner of your screen, the audience chat, Teresa offers ape-like drunks. John's slaving kegs. John's going straight for the kegs. End of a long teaching day for John.
Both images. Yeah, the image shows alcohol, gunpowder, stealing the ballot box, ape-like. The Irish in particular were often portrayed and described using really animalistic notions, savagery, ape-like, somebody said. They were often referred to as descended from primates or descended from Africa, so they were really to a degree racialized. Yeah, I see lots of comments about alcohol, non-human features, drunkenness.
Sort of a violent grittiness, that's right.
Yeah. Yeah, and we see, it's interesting that we can see some of these images all the way back to the 1840s still being used with immigrants even today. It's really a remarkable thing. So here's one more cartoon that brings in the Catholic Church, which was another part of what people saw as problematic, particularly about the Irish. Anti-Catholicism was extremely strong in the early to mid 19th century. And you get this sense of it there with a priest, looking over what an Irishman is doing as he's carving away at the Democratic Party. And again, you see the sort of bestial way of representing the Irishman in this picture. So that already, just through everyone's comments, we already have a pretty good sense of the character of the xenophobia directed at the Irish and Germans. Particularly, it was directed at the Irish because they came to America much more impoverished. They were Catholic. They were desperate for help. They tended to get slated into the worst jobs. And so for all of that, they tended to face the worst prejudice. So they would be talked about as drunkards, as criminals, slum dwellers. As I said, there was often a racial element. But anti-Catholicism was a very big part of it, a huge fear that Irish becoming a part of American politics in particular would mean that the Pope would begin to have an influence in American politics. So we see not just a sort of cultural prejudice towards the Germans and Irish, but also you see the emergence of a powerful political party known as the Know Nothing Party, which is profoundly hostile to immigrants. That's really its whole reason for being. The interesting thing, though, about xenophobia in this period is that the Know Nothing Party and other anti-Irish or anti-German politicians, they never tried to restrict immigration. There was no talk of eliminating the Irish and Germans in this period, so it's very different in that sense from today or even from what's going to be happening by the early 20th century. Instead, the goal was to keep them from becoming citizens, trying to pass laws that would prevent them from being naturalized until they'd lived in the US for 21 years, things like that. I see a question about, were cartoons like this pervasive or more targeted for particular publications? I think you would see them in a lot of different kinds of places, absolutely. So as much as it was difficult to be Irish in America, it was nothing like the prejudice and hostility that greeted Chinese immigrants. In California, for example, the anti-Chinese movement leads to creation of the Working Men's Party led by Dennis Carney. Their main slogan is "The Chinese must go," and anti-Chinese sentiment spreads through the United States. You see here a famous brochure from the period, which is very interesting in the way it's framing this issue of the Chinese: meat versus rice, American manhood versus Asiatic coolieism. Which shall survive? It's often the Chinese question was framed this way, as the Chinese are threatening the very survival of the way of life in America. And so, looking at a few more cartoons, you get a sense of some of the parallels and differences between how the Chinese were portrayed and how the Irish were. The central cartoon was created by someone who was basically more friendly to Chinese and is pointing out the irony that communists, socialists, hoodlums are welcome, but no admission for the Chinese. On the other hand, the one showing Scott's Exclusion Act, as the Chinese Exclusion Act is passed in 1882, there's more and more portrayal of Chinese, as we saw with the Irish, portraying them as subhuman, as bestial, comparing them, as in this case, you might say, to rats or insects. We also see in this period growing violence towards the Chinese. There are a number of riots or massacres in which often white workers will attack a Chinese part of town to try to push the Chinese out, literally. In Rock Springs, Wyoming, for example, perhaps the worst massacre of all, white miners attacked a Chinese part of town, set it on fire, leading to death of many, many Chinese. Tremendous, really tremendous violence against the Chinese. So it's in this context that the Chinese Exclusion Act is passed in 1882. And I'm sure many of you teach this important act. Chinese laborers will be barred from the United States originally for 10 years, although it's renewed and becomes permanent until it's finally overturned in 1943. And Chinese immigrants already in the United States are barred from becoming naturalized citizens. This is a hugely important act because it was the first time in US history that a specific group, ethnically or racially, would be excluded. One of the reasons why the Chinese Exclusion Act is so important, in addition to the impact, obvious prejudicial impact it had on Chinese immigrants, is because of the way it shaped other immigrant groups as well. The sense of let's deal with the immigrant problem by getting rid of them, by excluding them, soon spread to other groups as well. And we begin to see the same kinds of forms of prejudice spreading towards Jewish immigrants and Italian immigrants in particular. And many of those same themes appear again and again. They are said to spread disease, to commit crime, or to be followers of a foreign religion. So as the Chinese Exclusion Act ushers in more ideas about restriction, this also is soon combined with new scientific theories of racial hierarchy, including eugenics, the idea of creating racial purity through genetic manipulation. Eugenics becomes extremely influential in the United States after 1900. You see books like these, Madison Grant, a very aristocratic native-born American who writes The Passing of the Great Race, who argues in it, to him, to Grant, the biggest problem was the Jewish immigrant. He believed that, very much influenced by eugenics, he believed that if there was intermarriage between people of different ethnic groups, that the more inferior ethnicity would dominate their offspring, and it would lead to creation of a mongrel race. And so with that in mind, he became a very important force against immigration. All of this culminates in 1924 with that infamous act, the Johnson-Reed Act, which bans all Asian and nearly all Eastern and Southern European immigration. And the quotas that are established are they're racial in the sense that they're clearly portraying Southern and Eastern Europeans as inferior races. And so their quotas are tiny, whereas if you're English or you're German or you're Scandinavian, you're allowed a much higher quota so that your countrymen can still immigrate in larger numbers. So with that bill passed, the decades from 1924 to 1965 naturally sees kind of shifts in xenophobia as well. There's increased Filipino and Mexican migration after 1924, and much of the xenophobia becomes focused on those groups. Mexicans in particular are hit with tremendous hostility when the Great Depression occurs. By the early 1930s, there's a massive movement to make people of Mexican descent leave the United States. Scholars refer to it as the repatriation movement. It's pushing out both Mexican immigrants and their native-born American children. Probably more than half of those forced out of the United States were US citizens of Mexican descent. Likewise, of course, we see during World War II the internment of people of Japanese descent and the ways that violated basic rights. Again, 2/3 of those interned in camps during World War II were U.S. citizens of Japanese descent. Bracero guest worker program brings millions of Mexicans to work during and after World War II, but at the same time, there's an increasing concern about unauthorized Mexican immigrants, and so in the early 50s, Operation Wetback, as it is pejoratively called, deports more than 1 million Mexican immigrants. And of course, during and after World War II, the United States record is very poor in terms of not helping many Jewish refugees who are fleeing Nazi Germany. Post-1965, as that 1965 Act opens the door to much more immigration, including much more from Latin America and Asia, we see the rise of an extremely powerful anti-immigrant movement. It's kind of too complex to get into in great depth here, but the important thing about Hart-Celler Act is that it even though it tried to end the racial quotas of 1924, it began to generate much harsher border policies. It didn't really take into account the historic relationship between Mexico and the U.S. and the ways in which historically Mexican immigration had been encouraged by employers. And so it generates more undocumented immigration. That then coincides with demographic change and economic and social anxieties to unleash a tremendous degree of xenophobia. And so we've seen the period that we're living through now and for the last several decades has seen an almost unparalleled movement against immigrants. We see groups like FAIR, the Federation for Immigration Reform, which has been very much focused on dehumanizing immigrants, particularly unauthorized immigrants, by referring to them as illegals. They claim, again, in ways that echo back all the way to the Irish, claiming that undocumented immigrants bring crime, they use drugs, they are freeloaders, etc. And with that, increasing reliance on deportation and detention, particularly since 2008. So we'll turn to more cheerful things in a minute about how immigrants have responded to all this. But for now, just to kind of wrap up how scholars think about this long history of xenophobia, important to keep in mind that it has created tremendous barriers to equality for immigrants, even as its character has shifted over time. Today, the period we're living through now, it's really important to kind of step back and come to terms with the ways in which it has transformed the experience of being an immigrant in the United States today, the ways in which immigrants today have to fight for the most basic rights, including even very basic things like recognition that they are human beings. All right, so now we get to the third part, how immigrants have responded to all this, the ways they have been key players themselves in the fight for equality. This country would be a very different place and a far lesser place had not immigrants and their children and their allies, their native-born allies, not fought hard for equality across history. The image you see here is a young man, Wong Kim Ark, who I'll talk a little bit more about in a bit. And I don't know, I think everyone received some readings I suggested, and that we might, as we get more into this section, we might want to talk a little bit together about some of those readings. So if we go back to the early to mid 19th century, to those Irish and Germans and Scandinavians, they certainly fought for equality, but their struggle was not, the discrimination they faced was not, didn't involve legal discrimination the way Chinese would be facing later and other groups. And so their fight for equality was mostly one about using other social movements to express themselves. They became extremely important leaders in the labor movement in the mid to late 19th century. They became, German immigrants in particular, became very important leaders in the abolitionist movement. You think about somebody like Karl Schurz, for example, who'd been a German 1848er fleeing the revolution in Germany. A couple of images here of Terence Powderly, who became one of the most important labor leaders in the 19th century, head of the Knights of Labor. And he's posing there with Mother Jones, an Irish-American labor leader, the so-called miner's angel. Asian Americans took different approaches, and they are so important and so fascinating to examine as a historian. So important in the ways they fought against prejudice using legal means. Of course, after the Civil War, the 14th Amendment gives citizenship to anyone born in the United States. The Naturalization Act, which had, the original Naturalization Act in the United States said that the only people who could become citizens were quote unquote free white persons. And so after the Civil War, that Naturalization Act is revised to allow people of African descent to become citizens. But what will happen with Asian and Arab descended people? They will not be allowed to become naturalized citizens for another 70 or 80 years. And that's one of the things that most amazes my students when they start learning about how much these basic rights involved racial limitations and prejudice. So the question then became, will the children of those who are barred from becoming citizens themselves have the right to birthright citizenship? And so one of the fascinating things about Chinese Americans was, as they confronted these kinds of discriminatory laws, they began setting up legal teams to test them. And one of the results was the case of Wong Kim Ark that I sent you some excerpts about. So Wong Kim Ark, a young man who is born in the United States, his parents are Chinese subjects loyal to the Chinese emperor. And at some point he leaves the US to visit family in China. And when he comes back in, he's not allowed in. And his case, he sues for the right to birthright citizenship under the 14th Amendment. And the case goes all the way up to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court holds in Wong Kim Ark versus the US 1898 that birthright citizenship is a right that belongs to all, including the children of people who are, quote unquote, ineligible for citizenship. Now think back to what I was saying about the discrimination, the prejudice that Chinese immigrants face, the way they were slapped in the face and told they would never be eligible for citizenship, the massacres and riots. In that context, for the Supreme Court to say, okay, all that's happening, but your children, they are birthright citizens. That was an amazing Supreme Court decision. I wonder if anybody had comments or thoughts about the excerpt from the Wong Kim Ark excerpts of the Supreme Court decision that I shared with you.
Thank you. And this will give you a moment to have a drink of water. We'll let folks add their comments and their questions into the chat box. I'll note, too, that if you're interested in more information about this case, we have a recording of a webinar that we did last year with Erica Lee from University of Minnesota that talks quite a bit about this case. Any thoughts, any questions? Here's a question for you, Professor. It's not precisely about that prompt, but Tara asks if you could comment on this question. As the Chinese fight for legal rights, how are they so savvy in their use of the legal system? Is there a group that's advocating on their behalf, or are they banding together to bring about their claims?
Right. Yeah, that is a good question. They do have resources, and they pool their money and create legal teams. So much of the discrimination they face is legal. So in addition to the Chinese Exclusion Act, there are many acts stipulating how many Chinese will be allowed on ships that come to the U.S., laws that prohibit Chinese women from entering the U.S. So Chinese Americans and Chinese immigrants know that fighting for equality means first and foremost taking on these legal forms of prejudice. And so they use their considerable resources that they're able to pull together to create these legal teams.
Great, thank you.
To me, when I look at those, I teach the Wong Kim Ark decision a lot, and I encourage you to look at the full decision. It's clear to me when you look at the Supreme Court justices thinking in this case that they are struggling, that they can't quite grasp that they're really going to have to let Wong Kim Ark be a citizen. And yet, in the end, they decide they must. And if you look at the excerpts I showed you, clearly they decide they must because of the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment says that anyone born here who is not subject to a foreign nation's authority is a birthright citizen. That clause is still debated today, right? We see a lot of politicians today, including President Trump, saying that birthright citizenship should be overturned. And when they talk about overturning it, they talk specifically about that clause. They say that Wong Kim Ark's parents were loyal to the Chinese emperor, so he should not have been given the right to birthright citizenship. But the Supreme Court justices disagreed. And they said, no, the 14th Amendment says he's a citizen. But they said one other thing that is so fascinating, and I don't know if you caught it in the excerpt I sent. They also say, if we denied him birthright citizenship, we would also have to deny it to the millions of European immigrants coming to the U.S. And basically, they didn't say this part, but I'm sure it was in their thinking. We need those millions of European immigrants to settle the North American continent. And so they realized that they can't. My students always find that clause in the decision that we can't deny it to him or we'll have to deny it to the Europeans, to be a very revealing part of the decision. Another huge, but not as successful legal battle came a few decades later. I gave you an excerpt from the Thind versus U.S. Supreme Court case, but just as a little, to put that in context, let me say just a few words about the Ozawa case that preceded it. Ozawa was born in Japan, but had lived in the U.S. for 20 years and petitioned to be naturalized. He said, "My skin is lighter than that of many citizens. I'm basically white. I have strong moral character. I embrace American political ideals." But the Supreme Court said, no, you might look white, but we will base our opinion on science. And as we look at science, we see that you are not Caucasian. And the Naturalization Act of this country limits naturalization to white or Black people. So Ozawa lost his case. So Bhagat Singh Thind looks at that and says, okay, you want to talk about science, let's talk. Soon after the decision in the Ozawa case, Thind, an Indian Sikh, files for naturalization, and he uses as his arsenal, he uses science. He says, according to all the scientific classifications of race, I am Caucasian. I am a white man. I'm a high caste Aryan South Asian. He had been born in India, came to the U.S., studied at Berkeley, and served in the military during World War I. I think that's a typo there. That would have been World War I, not II. So in his case, in Thind versus U.S., the Supreme Court rejected his reasons and declared him ineligible for citizenship. So I wonder if you saw from the excerpt I sent what the reasons were for rejecting that.
Let's take a moment. We'll have folks type their responses in the audience chat box, please. What was the argument of the justices? We'll pause just a moment, give you a chance to type in your thoughts. Supreme Court rejected his reasons, declared him ineligible for citizenship. What was their argument? You can hear them frantically flipping through the pages, Julie. Going back to their neck.
Yeah. I always tell my students, if you want to see smart people doing some crazy reasoning, go read a Supreme Court decision like Thind versus U.S. Pretty amazing. I mean, Thind kind of had them trapped, right? Because they had used science to decide the Ozawa case. And he said, by scientific reckoning, I am white.
Molly's asked that we go back to the previous slide. So, Molly, I'm going to do that for you. And a couple of answers are coming in. Krupel notes that while he was Caucasian, he wasn't. Now my chat box is starting to scroll out of my view here. He was not. Yeah. Every time I try to read it, it scrolls out. He wasn't white according to popular understandings of the term.
Yeah, right. The common man. The justice's argument was, I see, and I'm reading a comment here, if I can keep up with the scrolling too. The justice's argument was that according to common understanding, he was not white. That is really one of the most astonishing Supreme Court decisions I have ever read. They held that, in essence, science does not matter here, because the founding fathers, when they said naturalization is only for free white persons, they weren't thinking about what science tells us white is. They were thinking about the common man's understanding of white. They say, think about the founding fathers. They were talking about people who were bone of their bone, flesh of their flesh. It's just an amazing thing for them to have said. They said, it may be true that the blonde Scandinavian and the brown Hindu have a common ancestor in dim reaches of antiquity, but the average man knows perfectly well that there are unmistakable differences between them. And it is not impossible, if that common ancestor could be materialized in the flesh, we would discover that he is differentiated from both of his descendants. In other words, they explicitly say it comes down to what the common man on the street thinks white is. And let me tell you, they would have said, the common man does not think that you are white, Mr. Thind. So the Supreme Court of the United States explicitly repudiated scientific definitions of race and whiteness and said, I'm sorry, you're just not white. The words of familiar speech, which were used by the original framers of the law, were intended to include only the type of man whom they knew as white. When they extended the privilege of citizenship to any alien being a free white person, it was these immigrants, born bone of their bone, flesh of their flesh, that they had in mind. The words white person are words of common speech to be interpreted in accordance with the understanding of the common man. A remarkable and just a really great text for teaching with students. So it would not be until 1946 that people of Asian descent, of South Asian descent in particular, would have the right to become naturalized citizens. There are many other ways we could talk about how immigrants have fought for equality. And earlier we had the question about, in particular, about the period 1880 to 1924. The struggles of Asian Americans are the most dramatic in this period because of the way they so systematically tackled legal discrimination. But I do want to point out that European immigrants fought very hard to stop the racial quotas that were passed in 1924. There's one of the more prominent people pictured here, Isaac Hauerwich, Russian, who fought to oppose the restrictionist politics of the early 20th century. Another example is someone like Mary Anton, a Jewish immigrant who wrote about her experiences and lectured widely around the country in order to try and generate better understanding of immigration and immigrants' contributions to America. Mary Anton is a fascinating case, and her book is a lovely one to teach with students. She had been born in 1881 in Belarus, then part of the Russian Empire. She emigrated to the US, and she wrote this book. Originally appeared as a set of articles in The Atlantic, published it as a book in 1912 to bring to life both the upbringing and the anti-Semitism she had faced in Russia, which of course was a huge part of what pushed Russian imperial Jews to come to the United States, but then also to talk about how she became American, and what it meant to her, how she embraced America and how she assimilated. That famous quote from her book, "How long would you say, wise reader, it takes to make an American?" She lectured widely. She became a best-selling author, and whenever she lectured, she really championed an open door, widespread immigration, and its benefits to America. In 1914, she published "They Who Knock at Our Gates," a polemic against the growing restrictionist movement. And I don't know if you read the passage from her book that I sent out, but I just think it's such a beautiful and poetic statement of the immigrant experience, both the reasons why her family felt compelled to leave Belarus, the challenges they confronted in America, but also her embracing of the American way of life and her excitement about that. There's so many other ways we could talk about immigrant struggles for equality. It doesn't always take the form of fighting for birthright citizenship or writing a book like Mary Anton's. Latinos, for example, have followed in part the same kind of strategies that the Irish and Germans had in the 19th century, using the building of a powerful labor movement in order to help achieve equality. Mexicans in particular have played a particular role in U.S. history. As I sort of hinted at earlier, they've been the quintessential group that has confronted this pattern of, we need you because we need your cheap labor, but oh, now we don't need your labor, so it's time for you to leave. Being recruited here and then pushed out over and over again. And so part of their struggle has been, in order to be seen as equal, has been a struggle to stop this pattern of being seen as a disposable labor force. Their work, their labor organizations, their sense of Chicano power has become an extremely influential way of building equality among a specific ethnic group. More recently, I'll just touch on this briefly, but more recently we can see that there's been a powerful movement to advance rights for immigrants as well. Even though I said earlier that that the period since the mid-1970s has seen one of the most powerful anti-immigrant movements in all of American history, it's been matched by a very robust movement to extend human rights and civil rights to immigrants as well. We've seen massive protest marches, for example, again and again, people coming together to demand dignity for all who cross borders. We see across the country scores of organizations, thousands, if not millions, of activists across the country. At the border, humanitarian groups like No Mas Muertes, No More Deaths, organizations at the local level across the country, a couple that I've worked with, Casa de Maryland or Heartland Workers Center in Omaha, Nebraska. We see nationwide groups. The immigrant rights movement today is very multi-pronged. It tries to, on one level, it fights to have undocumented immigrants not referred to pejoratively as quote-unquote illegals. It fights to change the culture of America. At the same time, it also takes on legal struggles, trying to tackle discriminatory laws. So it's a complex and full-fledged movement. And it, even though right now, given the current administration, things seem pretty tough for immigrants, especially undocumented immigrants. It's important to keep in mind that according to research organizations like Pew Research, the vast majority of Americans believe that immigrants are providing important benefits to this country. The vast majority of them want this country to be treating all immigrants, authorized or unauthorized, with more of a sense of human rights and dignity. The recent decades, the struggle between anti-immigrant or pro-immigrant groups often has focused on those who are undocumented. They are really on the front line of the issue. Should they have the right to full human and civil rights? Because that has been kind of the target by those who want greater restrictions. Unauthorized immigrants have felt particularly dehumanized, particularly attacked by the movement, the restrictionist movement of the last several decades. And so this context made the essay published by Jose Antonio Vargas particularly important. It was really kind of a watershed moment. In 2011, he published this essay in an issue of the New York Times magazine, in which he basically came out as unauthorized. A prominent journalist had won a Pulitzer Prize for some of his writing. He told a story, which maybe you read in the reading I sent. He told a story of coming to America, of learning with a shock in his mid-teens that he was an unauthorized immigrant, and then struggling for the next 15, 20 years to come to terms with this, feeling like he had to live in the shadows, that he had to constantly be afraid of deportation. 1 year after his original article appeared, he was on the front cover of Time magazine, as you see here, in a story about his continued problems with his immigration status. The next day after this Time magazine issue appeared, Obama announced that he was going to halt the deportation of undocumented immigrants aged 30 and under. Vargas himself had just turned 31, and so Obama's ruling sadly did not apply to him. Vargas says, "I am an American, I just don't have the right papers." In 2018, his memoir, Dear America, Notes of an Undocumented Citizen, was published. The original essay from 2011 is a powerful read. His memoir is also, I think, a really good teaching tool. So we've covered a lot of ground today, and we've seen a lot of history. Certainly, we've seen that the immigrant experience is central to American history, as is the discrimination they face, but also their struggles for equality. I think when I teach immigration history, I need my students to learn about the laws and the xenophobia and the discriminatory legal structures immigrants have faced, but I also really want them to understand how immigrants have responded and the ways in which their robust struggles for equality have made America what it is and have often helped result in full civil and human rights for other people as well. Immigrants' struggle for equality helped not only them, but it most certainly affects their American-born children as well, and often other, even native-born Americans. That longer struggle is one of returning humanity and dignity to all immigrants so that they know they are in America and not underneath it. One reason why it's really exciting for me to speak to a lot of teachers is that at the Center for Global Migration Studies, we're really working to try to help ensure that that immigration history is taught and understood by all. So just to tell you about a couple of resources at our website, I put a link here to it. One of the things that we've done, we were founded in 2010, myself working in partnership with my colleague, Ira Berlin. Ira Berlin said to me one day, it was all his idea. He came up to me and he said, "Don't you think immigration is the most important issue this country's going to face in the next 10 or 20 years?" I said, "Yeah, I think so." And he said, "Okay, let's start a center to deal with it." So the center came out of that. And one of the things we've done that I think could be a great resource for teachers is we've created what we call the Archive of Immigrant Voices. It includes videos and transcripts of oral histories that our students conduct. And we now have about 200 oral histories there that you can access at the website that's listed there. So thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Professor. We do have a lot of questions that have queued up, and I'd like to take the last 10 minutes or so to bring these to your attention. I'll try to put them in an order somewhat from the compelling story that you shared with us tonight. I'd like to start with this question. I thought it was pretty smart the way that you set up tonight's talk by offering all the ways that immigrants were dehumanized through political cartoons, images, slurs, etc. And then by the end, seemed to suggest that the real way to, as Christopher noted, you said, to return the humanity to immigrants was by really focusing on vignettes of individual people with their own personal stories, their own individual identities, and that was sort of a pedagogical tool really to help us understand these complexities. And of course, the archive that you mentioned, the Oral History Project, seems to do that as well. We've got a lot of folks in the room tonight who also teach in English language arts classes. Are you familiar, or can you share with us any ideas about using literature or fiction or other kinds of readings to continue to humanize the immigrant experience?
Oh, yes. Oh, my goodness. Yes. I think that literature is such a great way to help students grapple with some of these complexities. I think Mary Anton's book is memoir, not fiction, but it's a very literary, beautiful read. I often give assignments to my students where I ask them to analyze a novel or memoir. One of my favorite books that I teach on immigration is Out of This Furnace by Thomas Bell. A tremendous book that traces a Hungarian family of workers from about 1880 to 1940 or so. A tremendous book. But then, there are other, for almost any period or aspect of American immigration history, you can find tremendous novels and memoirs. I'd be happy if anyone wants tips to respond and provide some ideas.
If you like, maybe if you have some time, send me a short bibliography and I'll post it in the digital library and make sure that all of our participants receive it.
Yeah, I'd love to do that. Someone I saw in the chat just mentioned one of my favorite writers to teach is Edwidge Danticat. She has a brilliant memoir about her uncle trying to get entry to the United States from Haiti. And how he deals with the detention system. Tremendous book. So yeah, there's a lot out there.
Fantastic, thank you. I'd also like to bring this question from Carl Rosen. Carl asked a little bit earlier in the talk tonight, and I'll try to paraphrase this. He notes that we often hear Americans criticize undocumented immigrants by saying something like, yes, my grandparents were immigrants, but they were legal immigrants, unlike these people who don't follow the laws. His question is, do we have the same concept of legal and illegal immigration today as existed in the 19th and early 20th century?
That's such a great point. And that's one of the things that my students always find most illuminating about immigration history, is that it's a way to dispel a lot of the common myths like that. You know, my great-grandparents came legally, but not these people now. The thing is that the whole system was so different then. Unless you were Chinese in 1900, there was no such thing as undocumented immigration. It's a very, very different system. And, you know, it's been a great success of the anti-immigrant movement to try to push anyone who's here without documents as therefore illegitimate. They're just out beyond the pale of what we consider natural or almost even human. But the fact is, employers are recruiting people to come. People come in part because of policies of the U.S. that have generated disorder and violence, especially, say, in Central America. And we have historic relations with some countries like Mexico. So the whole thing of who's here without documents is much more complex than a simple referring to them as illegal immigrants can quite deal with.
Great answer, thank you. Another question for tonight. This one comes from Moonku Kim, and she asks if the American dream, if this notion of the American dream was one of the pull factors that brought immigrants to America all through the last 200 years, how much of the xenophobic messages and the actions that were actually happening here, how much of those were known outside of the United States?
That would be a great question for a research project. I am not sure. I think I think it certainly did not. I think that some of the xenophobia was surely known. For example, the Catholic Church was alarmed. Different governments were alarmed and tried to take action against xenophobic attitudes. But I just don't think the knowledge of the xenophobia was able to overcome the idea that you could make it in America.
This question is from Suzanne. She asks, without necessarily giving a time frame, so I'd invite you, Julie, to sort of figure out where you'd like to place this question. But were there certain cities or regions known to be friendlier to immigrants? And if so, what factors influenced this? And I think she's asking other than port cities.
That is an interesting question. And I think, historically, most immigrants go to cities. In the period before 65, most immigration was pulled here by industrial work, and industrial work was predominantly in cities. I think the answer would depend a lot on the ethnic group and the period in question. It'd be impossible to generalize too much about that.
Fantastic. And last question for tonight. This one goes to Robert, and he asks pretty early on in our session tonight, but I'm going to bring this to you so you can tie in your labor history expertise as well. He asks, how did the government use the threat of increased immigration as a way to counter the demands of organized labor and calls for the expansion of civil rights?
Oh, yes. That is a really important point, and we could do a whole lecture just on that. The threat of that immigrants hurt workers has been a theme throughout the history, and as a result, I'm sorry to say that the white native-born American working class has not until recently had a very good track record on these issues. So often ethnicity and nationality as well as race have been used to divide workers against each other. And so in my labor classes, one of the things we talk a lot about is that the labor movement is only as strong as its ability to embrace everyone as a brother or sister can be. That you have to, first and foremost, you have to overcome those divisions or you're just completely lost. And it's not just the government that has used that, but employers have used that very effectively as well.
Great. Julie, my last question is actually going to come from me. We're going to wrap tonight's session up with this question. Professor, are you optimistic right now? Are you optimistic about the future of immigration?
I am. I'm an optimist.
Yes.
Some people say it's because I'm from Nebraska and we all want to be optimists there. But I am, because I know that most Americans see things a lot more like I do than see them the way our current president sees them. Most Americans know that immigrants are doing incredibly important and beneficial things for this country. Most Americans don't harbor hatred based or even hostility based on race or ethnicity. So I know that we're in the process of turning things around.
That's wonderful. I'm optimistic as well. And of course, with so many educators tonight learning from and interacting with you on this topic, it causes even more reason for optimism as they take this work to their students. Professor Green, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Sure. Thank you all so much.
I'd also like to thank Lindsay Galveo for being our teaching assistant. She was fantastic in the audience chat, sharing resources that she has collected and curated and published. And I do want to encourage all of you who have been sharing ideas and resources and lessons in the chat box to take a moment and go to the digital library and use the open author tool. You can submit those lessons to be published in our OER library. You'll receive a direct citation from the National Humanities Center, and we'll be able to share that broadly with other educators who are considering the same kinds of issues. Thanks again for joining the National Humanities Center tonight. You can follow us and tap into upcoming events and activities through our social media. That's our Twitter feed and our Facebook page. Be sure you sign up for the email listserv as well. And of course, our digital library is really the primary hub in our education department, and as we get that work out. Our next session is scheduled for October the 13th. We'll be working with Robert Talese from Vanderbilt University. He's a professor of philosophy, and he will be working with us on understanding the destruction of polarization in our current society, the problem of polarization. I do hope to see you at the next session. If you can't join us, then I hope to see you in a future Humanities in Class webinar series. Good night, everyone. Have a great day in school tomorrow. Good night.